My name is Eva Kuper. I'm a Holocaust survivor now living in Montreal, who was born here in Warsaw and who spent the early part of my life until the age of 8 in Poland. We're standing specifically now, or I'm standing specifically now, at a place which is called UMSCHLAGPLATZ. This was within the ghetto area, and it was at the border of the ghetto where the train tracks bearing the cattle cars that evacuated the Jews from the ghetto came up right to the border of the ghetto, right behind this monument. And on one day in 1942, September 1942, my mother and I was 2 years old, were rounded up in the ghetto, as was everyone else in our area of the ghetto. And we were brought here, herded, together with hundreds of other women and children, hundreds and hundreds of other women and children. Only women, only children that day. And we were crowded together. Everybody was upset, frightened. Children were crying. There was a lot of noise. Guards, dogs, panic. The myth that the Nazis tried to spread was that by getting on the trains, and this myth was spread by the Judenrat, by the Jewish government, because the Nazis, in their wisdom, thought that if the orders came from other Jews, that people would be less frightened and more compliant. So the myth was that people would be taken by train to a place of better life. Life would be better, jobs would be better, there would be more plentiful food since people were starving. You have to know that the ghetto, which had housed 30,000 people before, that area had housed 30,000 people before the war, once the ghetto was established, housed in excess of 400,000 people at the height of its population. So conditions here were unbearable, and people were only too happy to believe that something better was awaiting them. It's human nature. But the evacuation started in July 1942, and by September, when we were here, my mother and I, no one had been heard of or from. No one had been heard from who had been evacuated before us. So there were many people, including my mother, who was convinced that she was going to her death. So we were rounded up, and eventually we were pushed onto one of the cattle cars. My father, meantime, having been released from the yard around the factory where he worked, ran to our room in the ghetto, to where our room was, and he found that the place was empty. Not only our room, but that whole area of the ghetto had been evacuated and brought here, the women and children. Just the women and children. And he alerted my mother's cousin Regina, who was a prison guard in the Warsaw Ghetto prison. And her mother and sister shared our room, and so she was concerned for them as well as for my mother, who was not only her cousin, but also her best friend. So my father alerted Regina, and he ran here to UMSCHLAGPLATZ, and they didn't let him anywhere near because they didn't want men that day, and he was threatened at gunpoint. Meantime, Regina left her post at the jail, and she came running here, and she arrived at just the exactly right moment. She arrived just in time to see my mother and me, my mother holding me, I was 2 and I was tiny, holding me in her arms, being loaded onto one of the cattle cars. We were still at the front so she could see us. And without thinking of her own safety, she ran to that cattle car and started to scream at the top of her lungs that I was her child and that my mother was only babysitting for me. Amid all that noise, amid all the panic, somehow, by some miracle, my mother was permitted to hand me hand to hand, and I was thrown off the train to Regina's arms. And that cattle car, eventually the doors were shut, slammed shut, And eventually that train pulled away, and no one on that train was seen again. And my mother knew that she was going to her death. And I'm sure she had to fight very hard with her own instincts as a parent, as a mother, as a loving mother, a mother who had nothing but love for her child, who wanted to hold her child close to her, to keep her with her, to protect her with her own body. She couldn't do that if she wanted to give me the infinitesimal chance that I could be saved, because she was convinced that she was going to her death, and she was right. This was an unbelievable act, self-sacrifice, prescience, bravery, unbelievable. Regina returned me to my father, and the next chapter of our life in the ghetto began, which led to our escape, my father's and mine. But behind me on the wall, you'll see here markers. This is a holy place, a place of honor, a place where this is my 7th time here, I believe, and it's a place where it substitutes for the grave of my mother that I never had. It brings me to tears, because here you will find names, just given names, just first names, because for every name, whether it's Herschel, or whether it's Hadassah, or whether it's Fruma, or whether it's Jack, there could be hundreds of Jacks, hundreds of Frumas. My mother's name was Felicia. And here is her name. And further down along the stone is Regina's name, because at some point between September 1942, when we were taken, and the end of 1943, Regina was also put on a train, forced onto a train, and she too perished, was murdered at Treblinka, along with everybody else on her car, and the many, many hundreds of cars that went before her and after her. Her name is just down here. This place is a place where I often speak to groups, March of the Living groups, or groups of adults who travel here to Poland to visit the markers of our history. This is a very moving place for me. A place of sacred memory.